We're ready for the final session today. I want to thank everybody for getting back in the room so promptly so we can do this last session, which promises to be really interesting. And then we'll do a few concluding remarks and we'll be off to lunch. This final panel is the road ahead for Africa. And we also have another of our new moderators with us today, Vladimir Duthiers, who is with CNN and does much of their coverage from Western Africa and elsewhere. So, Vlad, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Craig. Let me start out first by introducing our panel. To my far right is Zohra Dawood. She's the executive director of the Open Society Foundation for South Africa. That's followed by, and he's made sure to tell me that I remind all of you that he is here as a private citizen, but he is Victor Borges, who is the former Foreign Minister of Affairs for Cape Verde and is now an independent consultant for the Africa Governance Institute. Seated to his left is Sendashonga. She's the Global Director for Program and Policy at the International Union for Conservation and Nature. And finally, last but not least, is Colonel Birame Diop. He is a partner and a director of Partners Senegal and directs the Africa Institute for Security Sector Transformation. So let me just welcome all of these speakers to our panel today. Thank you very much for coming. And I want to also sort of start out this discussion by saying that it's a great honor for me to be here and to take part in something like this, because over the course of the last 2.5 days, I've learned a tremendous amount. And one of the things that I actually did have an oh my God moment while I was here, and it wasn't when Grover Norquist suggested that Europeans emigrate to the United States. That wasn't my oh my God moment. My oh my God moment was during the discussion about youth. Right? And all of a sudden, for the very first time, I realized that I am not a part of that discussion. I am not, you know, you look at yourself in the mirror and you still see the 13-year-old nerd staring back at you, but then you look at your birth certificate and you go, oh my God, I'm middle-aged. And so thank you, German Marshall Fund, for reminding me and teaching me that I am finally middle-aged. Half the things we were talking about, I was like, wait, I don't see that way. And I think that's a great jumping off point to talk about something. We spent a whole session talking about the youth, and that's a great discussion point for our discussion about Africa, because we all know the demographics, right? We all know that Africa is growing. The population is exploding. It's expected to double in the next 15 or 20 years. And I think that when we talk about Africa and the youth, what we also see is that there's tremendous youth unemployment. And in some cases, 50% of people under the age of 25 are unemployed in urban areas in Africa. Yet on the other hand, we know the growth story, right? We know, for example, that China is Africa's biggest trading partner. We know that Brazil, investment in China in Africa went from about $2 billion US in 2000 to plus $12 billion over the course of 10 years. So how do we reconcile some of those issues, the issues surrounding the demographic, the population explosion? While infant mortality rates have come down, we know that, that people are still having, on average, more than 5 children per family. Is that a recipe for success, or are there some danger signs ahead? And I'll just throw that out to the panel, and first person who wants to answer can go ahead and answer that. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to congratulate GMF for organizing this panel, and I believe that Atlantic dialogues in Africa should give more space and more visibility to African politicians, to African scientists to come here to articulate their own vision, because most of times African leaders, African governments just recycle or consume concepts and ideas that are produced elsewhere. In spite of all odds, I believe that globalization empowers people to articulate their thoughts, and I believe that the dialogue in the future will be probably more tense, but I believe that it will be more fruitful because people know better what they want, and they want to be saying yes before thinking, or just to be kind. Going back to your questions, I believe that demographics is a huge issue in Africa. This can be a threat in some way if Africa didn't achieve the Millennium Development Goals, and the Millennium Development Goals is very humble goals for Africa development. And what is dramatic is that most of African countries are not going to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. So the demographics show us that there is an urgency on development. Because if you do not achieve development, and you have all this demographic, and the people in urban areas, young people without jobs but with a difference, with diplomas. So people that resent much more deeply the jobless situation. And the people, and we cannot forget that we are all glad to speak about IT, technologies of information, mass media, and the people that now can read their poverty on the affluence of people they see on TV. And this will make it an impossible situation. It will be a challenge for development, but quickly enough, it will be a problem of internal and international regional security. So development become much more urgent because of the demographics.
And that's a good point. And Zohra, we were talking about something in the green room. As the continent develops and as it grows, there is an urgency to, if there are a lot of young people, if there are people that's a fascinating statistic that the unemployment rate is high even though people have college diplomas and have achieved higher education. If the countries are growing and investment is booming in a particular country or on the continent, but people don't have an opportunity to work, they turn to other things to do. So governments have to not only support democratic principles, but they also, and the growth rate of the country, but democracy and the principles and have a really big part to play in that.
Absolutely. But just on the issue of demographics, let me sort of declare that an interest in not really responding to that. I'm one of 12 children of a refugee family, so that's a double whammy. So let's not go there in terms of birth rates. On that issue, I think, what comes to mind as we were having the discussion, the pre-discussion, was think about the slogan, and lots of left-leaning, whether it was civil society organizations, political movements, liberation movements, were often referring to the slogan that coalesced around the notions of trade, not aid. And that seems to be emerging more forcefully in Africa. Do new players like China, Brazil, India offer that prospect? For sure. And that, I would almost sort of juxtapose the new relations that center around the new centers of power, centers of gravity, by way of sort of how people describe emerging powers, against what partners like the US, European countries did, emphasizing democratic governance that would be linked and made conditional. African governments have a long, long way to go. If I were advising, I would say they have the option of using the dividends, the economic dividends, to strengthen democratic governance rather than to subvert democratic governance. And certainly in large parts of Africa, that's what we're seeing is, and I find it extremely troubling that during the commodities boom, you have the resources to respond ably to the very basic needs that are not being responded to. And when large numbers of people feel, and you know from Boko Haram, for example, yes, in Nigeria, when large numbers of poor people feel that they're not getting anything from the state, there's a whole slew of alternatives that people may find attractive,
right,
whether it's religious fundamentalism, you know, a whole range of other issues.
It's and I'm glad that you bring up Boko Haram, because security is obviously very, very important on the continent. Even when you have a country that is relatively stable, we can witness what we've seen over the last several months, for example, in Mali, right? It sort of took a lot of people by surprise what happened there. In Nigeria, where I'm based, the population is more or less evenly split between Christian and Muslim, and there has been an enormous amount of activity in the northern part of the country with Boko Haram. Now, the United States, for the moment, seems to have, you know, I mean, I think they're aware, and they are making concerted effort to work with with Nigerian government to combat that. But how is Boko Haram something that, you know, we're always focused in the West about Al Qaeda? Is Boko Haram sort of the next big threat? And I'll throw that question to the Colonel as you work in security.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank GMF for giving me the opportunity to participate in this panel. I would not talk about Boko Haram specifically in isolation. I would take the security paradigm globally. To me, having traveled in most of sub-Saharan African countries, the security aspect of everything we're doing is one of the main challenges we have to face. I have unfortunately noticed that we have not enough acknowledged the fact that the security paradigm has shifted recently in Africa. Instead of being hard security, is becoming more and more a soft security. We are dealing with a lot more ambiguous, complex, uncertain problems. And so the response to these insecurity issues require a larger collaboration between non-state actors as well as state actors, to make sure that the average African is at the heart of the security management. This is the only way, in my opinion, we can prevent these insecurity issues, including the one you were referring to, related to Boko Haram, and more largely to violent extremism and radicalization.
And one of the other things that I haven't heard mentioned too much during the last couple of days, but it's something that I think is very important, I think we sometimes forget about it, is conservation. And I'm going to sort of direct a question to Siri about this. You know, I've traveled, I have family in Haiti. You know, if anybody ever flown over Haiti, when you're coming across the border from the Dominican Republic, you can actually see the border between the two countries, because the Dominican Republic has made a concerted effort over the last couple of years to try to conserve their forests and their natural habitat, and so it's very green on that side, and on the Haitian side it's very brown. And you see that over the course of many years, as they've deforested that country, you've seen more mudslides, you see the poverty rates have just exploded, natural disasters. How important is it when we talk about all the other things that make Africa attractive, the investment, the youth demographics, how important is conservation on the continent?
Thank you. First of all, like the rest of the panelists, I also want to thank GMF for inviting my organization, or the organization which I represent here, IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, to be part of these very interesting dialogues. And you talked about my entry point, which is conservation, but rather seen from a broader perspective of really environmental protection, environmental conservation. We are in this forum, which is looking at the strengthening the Atlantic cooperation and dialogue. And in the last 2 days, we heard a lot of speakers, a lot of panelists, including our colleagues and friends from Brazil. And I use the opportunity to remind the audience, and I see quite a few people who I had met in Brazil a couple of months ago during the Rio +20 summit, which was the UN conference on sustainable development. So this discussion we are having about Africa, we have to, and the question is started by asking the demographics and everything else to security, indeed to cast them in the larger context of development, and more specifically, sustainable development, because it's a word I haven't heard in the last 2 days. Probably it's there, but we have to be quite explicit about it. Development and sustainable development are not exactly the same thing. And that allows me also, if you allow me, to go back to the day when this forum opened, and I think the moderator who was handling the opening session talked about, was it a couple of books or concepts about the revenge of history, the revenge of geography, and I want to put on the table another revenge, the revenge of nature. We haven't heard much about the global environmental challenges we are facing. Today, it began to emerge, climate change, many other things. So when you think of the future for Africa, the demographics, and I think the chairman of OCP, when he was also making the introductory remark, he showed that graph, that table of the youth of Africa, which indeed can be an opportunity or a constraint, depending which way you're looking at it. And we also heard a number of people saying the future belongs to Africa, da, 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 da. Yes, but I have a problem with that. Not that I disagree, but if it is not put with some qualifiers, with some conditions, the future Africa can be another major economic powerhouse if, and there are a number of parameters we have to fill there. Otherwise, it's like it goes automatically. Just because we have 50% of our population which is under, which belongs to the youth category, because we have a bounty of natural resources. We heard a lot about that in the discussion this morning and yesterday, the interest of other parts of the world, Brazil, China, India, focusing on the natural resources of Africa, plus, of course, the traditional players who have been there before, Europe and North America, etc. All of that is true, but Africa, it has to take advantage and can take advantage of those opportunities, its young population, its bounty of natural resources, if it opts for a path of development that is not going to reproduce the unsustainable production and consumption patterns we are seeing that are leading to some of the environmental problems that we have, including climate change. So what you said about Haiti indeed can be a very illustrative example of where, when you do not take into the equation, into what you do, the natural infrastructure that is a big asset in planning your socio-economic development, then you can have a number of problems. So that was just like by way of introducing the larger context in which we look at this.
But if countries say, look, I have a difficult time, I need to build roads, I need to ensure the population is being educated, I need to provide proper sanitation, water, medical facilities, as important as it is, does conservation become sort of, I'll get to that when I need to get to it? Is that, in other words, a lot of people would argue, look, I can't worry about that whether or not I'm saving the rainforest. I got to feed people.
Yeah, That is, if you continue to look at conservation and development as if they are adversaries. One is an absolute requisite for the other. Conservation does not prevent development. On the contrary, it provides further options for what you can draw upon to achieve the development that you want. This is why we think the notion of natural capital is very important in this context. For example, you're talking of the forest. We have been discussing, not very deeply, but somebody alluded this morning to the threat of climate change. Now, when you think of the role that forests play in mitigation of climate change, then you look at them in a completely different context. It's not something that you just have to use because you need the logs, the timber for your development, but also when you think of the 20% or so of contribution that forests make to CO2 sequestration, then it becomes a completely different picture. So, and of course, the countries that have forests, now we're talking of the Atlantic Basin. It's an opportunity for Brazil and the other countries in the Amazon Basin, Africa, especially the Congo Basin, with the huge forest blocks that are still there, to sort of come up with some cooperation to make a contribution to saving the global climate agenda, but also for the rest of the world to understand that for those countries to do that, they also need to precisely get something in return of what you're saying, what might be seen as the opportunity cost of foregoing other options in order to contribute to stabilizing the global climate.
That's a good point. Let's jump right into our audience and take some questions from the audience. I know Africa is, a big part of what we. Yes, sir. You want to kick it off for us?
Good morning. Mamour is my name, from the Gambia. I just wanted to comment on two issues that were touched on in the introduction: the issue of the high birth rates, as well as the paradox of the high economic growth rates as against high unemployment figures. I think we should start from the premise that we're dealing with a rational population, first and foremost, and therefore you have high birth rates for good reasons. Whether the reasons still hold as the society, the dynamics of society change, that's another matter. But you would want to recall that it really was a simple game of numbers. The more children, the greater the chances of survival in the face of, let's say, not universally available health facilities, for instance. And then secondly, dealing with a labor-intensive society where the more children you have, the more the prospects of providing food using labor-intensive methods for production.
But sir, let me just ask you, if that is the case, and what you're saying is that the birth rates are still going up, because it's a good thing. Children are surviving, right? They're being born, and the mortality rates have come down. But even in Nigeria, the government has asked people to try to limit their families to 4 children, and it's not working.
Yeah, but that is because now the health facilities have improved, and therefore the chances of survival are higher. Where, let's say, a higher percentage were not surviving, now you have a higher percentage surviving. It therefore moves us to the second question, economic success. And therefore, again, it's still, the more children you have, the greater the chances of having a successful offspring that will take care of you. So once these opportunities are safeguarded, and then there is conviction that there is a future for my children, then I'm pretty sure that it will impact on the birth rates. For instance, we talk about youth unemployment. You go to school, you invest in your children, they go to university and they don't have a job. So if you have 5 children, maybe 2 will have a job. So once this issue is addressed, maybe we will see a direct effect on the birth rates. And coming to the issue of the paradox, where you have high growth rates, I contend that there are 2 reasons why this is not translating into economic opportunities or job opportunities for the youth in particular. Is the economic growth happening where it should? If you take the mining industry, the extractive industry, these are not known for being employment intensive. So maybe you can get a lot of revenue, but you may not employ a lot of people.
Right.
Of course, it behoves the government of the day to translate those figures into job opportunities.
Let me out, because we're addressing a lot of things in this one question. Let's throw it back to the panel, and I'll ask everybody to just keep their answers fair. You know, everybody has their moment, but just don't take an hour. That's usually the joke. Yes, sir.
I will jump on what she said about the environment to say that we must overcome this very sectoral view of development and put together development, security, and environment. We cannot go on sectoral view that, for instance, if you go to the Ministry of Economics, you will speak about economy, about investments, and you forget about environment impact. So what we need is a broad, a holistic vision of development that includes security and environment. For instance, in Nigeria, in the Delta, we see that foreign investment is helping people to become more poor because they do not have fisheries, they do not have land, and they have a lot of problem with health. So we need this broad vision. The problem is that, and we all welcome foreign direct investment, but managing foreign direct investment is another stuff. And we tend to be angelical when we deal with foreign direct investment, and yet African countries and developing countries in general need strong states, strong human resource to manage foreign direct investment, to help investors meet their objectives, but to help countries to meet their objectives. But what did we see before this? Less state, and we have even fragile and failed states unable to manage foreign direct investment, and it is not an easy task to manage foreign direct investment. And usually they are not environmental friends. And when states began to speak about environment issues, things would become much more complicated, and there is a kind of blackmailing, even in the context of democracy, because we all agree that we need foreign direct investment. But if you find an administration that is, I am not saying strict, but attentive, right, to environment questions, you will have foreign direct investment, blackmailing or sensitizing as you want political actors, and in the end, all those environmental and security issues linked to foreign direct investment will be taken away to make the investment, and we all are glad to have this investment, but we need to combine.
So let's I see, I'm going to group some questions together, that way, so this gentleman here, and then Joy, and way in the back there, we haven't gotten anybody, and then you, sir. Testing.
Is it okay? Yeah, okay. Carl Halding from Stockholm Environment Institute. And I want to pick up on what you just discussed here, the confluence of security and environmental threats on the African continent. And one of the institutions on Earth, an important one that has seen this and acted on it, is the Pentagon. They saw the U.S. national interests being threatened by climate security around the world, and particularly how climate change is a threat multiplier in Africa and making already fragile states more fragile. And on top of that, you have the abundance of resources, which are, as you point out here, very difficult to manage in a good way, so that it comes the whole population that bring development rather than problems and strife. So my question is, how do you look upon the AFRICOM? Because one of the take-home messages from Pentagon's homework was to establish the AFRICOM. How do you look upon that?
Okay, let's go to Joy right there. There's somebody. Is there more than one person handing out microphones, or?
Thank you. My name is Joy Ezelo, Faculty of Law, University of Nigeria, and also the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Trafficking. Even concerning the subject matter I deal with at global level on human trafficking, every day when I look at Africa as the second continent after Southeast Asia, that is a major source country with regard to human trafficking. And then I look at the root causes, especially the issue of poverty, the youth unemployment, gender inequalities, and social exclusion, and even declining education, including qualitative education that will enable our youth to get decent work and be competitive in a global world. I'm wondering, and I'm reminded of my daughter who always, when I mention Africa, want to talk about it in that sense. He said, look, stop that, mommy. Africa is not just one country. I say, of course, I know maybe my global work and maybe the way people look at it in this global sense. I want to know from the panelists, really, what are the good models? We know Africa is diverse. We know maybe Nigeria could be a representative of Africa in terms of its diversity within the country and in terms of 1 in every 4 Africans being Nigerian. What do you think, where are the best example, or let's say good practice, that we can begin to push, bring out there to the fore, to say this country is doing well in managing the demographics, the youth unemployment planning, even in terms of governance and corruption. Where are the good examples? Or are we bereft of that in the whole continent? 54? Let's look at it. Because I think this is crucial, because the untapped youth demographics unarguably could be is a resource for sustainable development. At the same time, is a present and future challenge linked to the security challenge, Boko Haram that we're talking about, arms deal, drug trafficking, human trafficking. Because of the human security, where are the examples? And with regard to extractive industry, finally, I would like to ask my sister also in the conservative sector, to what extent do the external factors and external players also contribute to destabilizing Africa in this regard? And I know there have been a number of initiatives, including Publish What You Pay, transparency there, but still it doesn't appear to be happening. And then also the link to sustainable environment. Thank you.
This young lady here, go ahead.
Hello, I'd like to be Mariam, second year student at the School of Governance and Economy of Rabat. The African continent is on its way to development, yet we can observe one can observe that we still experience a lack of cooperation that is undermined by regional tension, excuse me. So I'm taking the example of the Mali or the failure of the Arab League. So my question is, by which means can we arrive to a certain cooperation or unification, and is it possible in a soon future? Thank you.
Okay, let's throw those questions to our panel and probably start with the last one first. Who wants to take that?
I would like to,
Go ahead.
Woman first.
Zohra?
Please.
Look, I absolutely agree that it's a myth to talk about what the late Gaddafi used to call the United States of Africa. That was just a political, expedient, Gaddafi-ish construction. I think it's a continent, a geography sorry, where there are enlightened, pockets of enlightened self-interest. And that's really the basis for how people interact, engage, trade, provide aid, enable movements of people or not. I'm thinking about, you know, the tensions between South Africa and Nigeria, for example. It's kind of brinkmanship on the continent, same continent, but brinkmanship and one-upmanship, and how these tensions have played out. So I think it's a little bit of a myth. I'm not sure that it's worth the energy, other than perhaps the symbolic, to talk about an Africa as a block. It's a geography, but perhaps, you know, some geographies are increasingly imagined geographies. So that's really, you know, a concern. And I think, you know, someone like Thabo Mbeki, Obasanjo, have put a huge amount of effort into creating, in the name of an African Renaissance, an African Union. There was NEPAD, there was the APRM. Where have those gone? Was it worth, I think the compelling question is, was it worth the investment other than at the symbolic level? That's the one issue. I'd like to bring the question back to that of how political classes in Africa purvey their interests and the sorts of governance, democratic governance institutions that they craft. And I want to use the word deliberately, craft, that really promotes their interest. So we spoke about development, about climate change, about conservation, about not being aware that one doesn't sell the family silver in the name of immediate gratification. I think so much of that question should be raised with political classes in Africa, with current governments significantly. And it's a question that we mustn't shy away from. There ought to be responsibility placed on the current political classes in Africa, rather than the sort of perennial issue around we were colonized, we were destabilized during the Cold War, and all of that is absolutely valid. The legacy issues are critical. The residual effects continue to be felt. But look at the levels of corruption on the African continent. And I think that requires, in my view, a huge amount of self-reflection.
You mentioned something interesting. I think a lot of people are always surprised about the idea that there is very little sort of, even with the political class, a little forward thinking about what we're doing today, how will that impact my country in 10 or 15 years? It seems to sort of be, let's just do this now, and then whenever the next election happens, let that guy worry about whether this project or this infrastructure issue is done. I mean, that's sort of along the lines of what you're saying, right?
Absolutely. You know, one of the interesting conversations for me when we were talking about the I generation a day and a bit ago was someone raised the issue, social media, the responses of young people are so impulse-driven. And perhaps the success of social media is on the very basis of being impulse-driven. It feels a little bit like that in some parts of the continent, where the current ruling class is driven by immediate interest, an interest perhaps based on filling their bellies in the quickest and shortest possible time, and kick the ladder out from under them, because as you rightly point out, come the next election.
Right. And I think that's very interesting, especially for when we talk about foreign investment, when we talk about other countries trading with countries within Africa, if you are not ensured that your investment is somehow going to pan out over the course of the next 5 or 10 or 15 years, especially if you're not just in the business of petroleum, it becomes very difficult for other countries, other businesses to take a look at what's going on there. And Colonel, you wanted to make a point, and then I have this gentleman ready to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like just to bring back the general dimension of the discussion we're having. We have talked about demography, environment, illicit trafficking from my sister from Nigeria. We talked about economic growth. So we can go all directions. And in my opinion, we are having this confusion going on our continent because we are more consumers of principles, ideas, and just problematics than producers of problematics. And why is that? It's because we have not taken time, in my opinion, to make sure that we have the right environment in all aspects, making sure that we have the security that ensures us serenity, educate our people, for them to be skilled, to think about what really matters for them. What are the priorities for us as Africans? Yes, one will say that Africa is not an homogeneous entity. Yes, I agree. But Africa can also, to some extent, be dealt with as a quite homogeneous entity. We have a lot of similarities.
If that's true, then, again, using an example like Nigeria, you have a country that has 200 plus different ethnic groups under one flag. We are saying, what we're saying, a lot of the things that we're talking about here sometimes seem sort of like in an ideal world, in a perfect world, wouldn't it be great if we were able to do some of the things that we're saying? But the reality on the ground is that it's very, very difficult for a leader to reach out to all these different ethnic groups who feel very little in connection with the guy sitting next to them on the bus because they just don't. So how do you overcome that in just a practical way?
Yeah, of course it's very challenging. I agree with you. But it is possible. And we have to do that. It's not because it is complex that we don't have to try. We have to try to make it less complex. And once we take time and work on what really matters, set our norms, set our priorities, and then start taking the initiative. Be more proactive than instead of being too reactive. We are not in this dynamic yet. And it's for our leaders, it's for our civil society, it's for all Africans. Each one of us. It's the domain he's working in to be in charge of this.
Yeah, thank you. The questions, of course, are all very, very good and very, very challenging. But I would like to say that in the context of the dialogue, this Atlantic dialogue in which we are, perhaps one of the things that we should take from it is precisely, and that refers to the question that my sister from Nigeria was asking, how we can learn from other countries, particularly in Latin America, like Brazil, which a few decades ago had probably challenges which are not very different from what Africa is experiencing, be it in the area of governance, be it in area of managing a country which is huge and has hundreds, if not thousands, of ethnic groups. So we are not unique. So I think this Atlantic dialogue can also be an opportunity, indeed, to learn from each other, to see how other countries in other parts of the world have dealt with this kind of questions. And in fact, coming back to the whole question of sustainable development in its three dimensions, economic, social, and environmental, I would suggest that the Atlantic Basin could be a good platform to try out some models of good development that addresses all those challenges. If we take the question of food security, for example, we heard yesterday or today somebody who was referring to the depletion of the marine resources of the Atlantic Ocean and how cooperation among all the countries that are part of that basin could really bring some solutions to halt that, because it's in the collective interest of all of us. How we can address the question of climate change, as I said, be it from the point of view of looking at the challenges that poses to the Caribbean, small island developing states, or Africa or Latin America, the question of energy transition, all the investments coming to Africa to basically take the energy resources, mostly, again, fossil fuel. Why can't we also help Africa? I'm talking now about the Americas and Europe and others, to also develop energy sources from a renewable basis. We have some experience going on here in North Africa trying to leverage the sun, photovoltaic, things like that. So we can learn from others, and I think this is really what I would see as one of the directions to go in this cooperation. And just one final point, touching on governance. The other day, there was a question posed that, do we want a broad, comprehensive Atlantic, regional, things like that? My view would be that, depending on the issue, different levels, different models of governance would be appropriate. Like in Africa, the challenge he was referring to about managing complex countries like Nigeria or others, which have multiple ethnic groups, maybe this is where entities like cities, the discussion we had yesterday, could come in. Sometimes there are solutions that are actually more applicable at a city or a town level, which work very well as opposed to the whole country. So nested governance, every level has appropriate solutions for given problems. So
let me thank you very much.
Before you take another
we want to engage the audience. So
I would like to comment on the comments of the lady from Nigeria. First, about youth unemployment and education system in Africa. And we have here a huge problem because states put a lot of money on the education system to produce people without jobs. So the education and training system must change completely if we want it to be an engine of development. And if we do not change the education system, we'll have people without jobs, but we'll have security problem, because you cannot have a lot of jobless people living in slums and hoping that everything will be fine. Another comment about weapons. And here I will comment on something we spoke a lot about in the last days, drug. And what's the difference between drugs and weapons? When we are fighting drugs, we go to the origin, to the producers of drugs, to say, we must control the production. Somehow, we do not forget, but we downplay the role of the market consumers, and we should know that with the market, the production will go on. With weapons, that is a huge problem in Africa, that prevent Africa to have the prerequisite for development. That means peace, stability, and security. And you have a lot of arms, weapons in Africa, and people do not dare to discuss this issue of the origin of those weapons. And those weapons were made elsewhere. Last comment on corruption. And I believe this is a huge problem for Africa. And it takes us to the questions of leadership, of human capacity to manage the country, but also human resource to control the government. But we could add that corruption also is not a specificity of Africa.
No, and I think
it's a visibility. But the difference I want to make is, what is different with corruption in Africa is that the money is taken away and put in American and European banks. And these banks should know. They should know, and they should know the salaries of those ministers and presidents. And they should know that it's not normal. So we let the people put their money. When we have problem, we will see BBC, CNN breaking news saying we are going to freeze the assets.
You bring me the documents and the paperwork, I'll have you on to Let's take this question. We have a couple of people, so let's keep the questions short. This gentleman here first, and then we'll keep please keep your questions short because there's a lot of people I see with their hands raised up here.
I shall try. Herman Marques from Portugal, from Nova Law School and the John Hare Staff and Command College at the Ministry of Defense. At the risk of being not politically but thematically incorrect, let me fold the conversation back on itself and go back to what I wouldn't call him brother, but my cousin, Vitor Borges, so vividly talked about when mentioning security and the link between security, education, development, freedom, democracy, and what we all deeply want for Africa. Having written myself a book on the applicability of the concept of social society to the Angolan case, I find it difficult to understand a comment that was heard on hard security, it was mostly soft security that was talked about here, about the Boko Haram. The Boko Haram are not in the same league as Hamas and Hezbollah, who provide social security networks there where the states do not. Boko Haram is a different type of entity altogether. It's loosely affiliated to Al-Qaeda. For some reason, they are called and call themselves Nigeria's Talibans. They're a different group of people altogether. They're moving in 2012, this very year. They've been attacking churches, Catholic churches, religious, other religions. They've been attacking schools. They've been attacking prisons, freeing prisoners, common prisoners from jails, losing them, letting them out in the streets. My point is the following. They're moving, if you look at it geographically, towards the sea. Now, on the Gulf of Guinea, in 2 years and 2 months, 2015, 25% of the oil produced in the US is going to come, they're diversifying naturally, from the Gulf of Guinea. In the Gulf of Guinea, my question is very easy. In the Gulf of Guinea, there's Tanger Med up here, building up, Algeciras in Spain, Lagos. Lagos has one target. On the other side, you have Santos, you have Açu. On the Brazilian side, you have a lot of portuary facilities, the enlargement of the Panama Canal. This poses a hard security problem. If Boko Haram goes for Lagos, it's worse than the Hormuz Strait. I'd like to hear something about this.
Okay, was there somebody else? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Dr. Kaba from Guinea and the Secretary General of Mano River Union, which is a sub-regional organization. I have one comment and 2 questions.
Can you try to keep it to one question, because there's 4 other people here that have questions. So if we can just, because okay. I've gotten the signal for 10 minutes. So if we want everybody to speak, let's.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was attracted to come in Rabat because I heard that we will have dialogue. So that's why I'm here. So please, my first comment is that when we are talking about Africa, we should talk about identity and citizenship. Ethnicity as such is not a problem. Ethnicity becomes a problem when it is used to get power. I think that is a problem. Secondly, I would like to ask the participant to this dialogue, what is the responsibility of the other countries and other continents on what Africa has become today. Because the result of the economic failures today in Africa is partly due to structural adjustment dictated by the World Bank and the IMF in the 80s in most of African sub-Saharan countries. They have said, okay, no more state, all private. And most of our problems now in the sub-region are coming from there. Having many children is not a problem. Myself, I'm mother of 7 children, and I can tell you that they have not failed. They all have succeeded to have a good education level. But again, what are the relations we put when we have so huge potential in terms of mineral resources? Developed countries are needing for their own development or their own economy. How they see themselves responsible for sharing in a sustainable way the management of these natural resources in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have, let me see people who are holding microphones just so I can get a sense. This gentleman back here, please.
Thank you. William Awinado from Ghana with the Ghana mission to the UN. I come from Ghana, and I have reason to be optimistic as a Ghanaian African. As I speak, our economy is one of the fastest growing economies. Only last year or a couple of months ago, the Chinese gave Ghana a credit line of $3 billion, the highest ever. Other African countries are receiving a lot of investments from Brazil, in South America, all the way to the other side of the world in Asia. All that is happening in Africa. The era of Afro-pessimism is behind us. We definitely are going through momentous changes. There will be tensions, and that is part of it. The US is not spared, one of the strongest economy. European Union is not spared. Some are so pessimistic to think that the EU is breaking up. I'm one of those who are confident that the EU is going to come out stronger. And the US is also facing challenges, and it will also come out stronger as long as we remain focused. Now, the problem I see in our discussion with Africa is this tendency towards Afro-pessimism, which we have overcome. My sister, you talked about NEPAD. Thanks to the African peer review mechanism, we are looking at governance structures in Africa. For the first time, you see the number of elections that are taking place in Africa. There will be disruptions here and there, but we are moving. The people are demanding their political and economic space. It's an ongoing movement. In West Africa, ECOWAS has domesticated NEPAD. My sister talked about sustainable development. Cape Verde is hosting the ECOWAS Center for Renewable Energy. And with partners from Europe, especially Austria and beyond, we are exploring all those possibilities, and they are ongoing. This morning, we're talking about China in Africa. When I was at ECOWAS, we kept getting questions from Europe. What are the Chinese doing in Africa? The point is this, that the world has come to a stage where Africa is being integrated in the global economy. And Asia is playing a strategic role. And in the Atlantic corridor, I think we need to leverage that. As the Asians bring in much needed gaps filling in terms of infrastructure development, investment in energy, roads, and all that, we have our European and American partners who have other areas of some support. So as the Atlantic Dialogue is seeking to promote, this should be our focus. How do we leverage the individual comparative advantages for mutual benefit? If I may conclude, at the UN level...
You have to sit with these people at lunch, so they're going to remember you.
There is a paradigm, there's a new economic paradigm about happiness, measuring gross national happiness instead of gross national product. And I think that is a new paradigm which my sister was talking to, which Africa has already positioned itself with a new partnership in terms of sustainable development and strategic partnerships, internal and external. I'm sorry I've taken
That's okay,
so long.
that's fine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take these last groups of questions, and then I will ask everybody to address them in their wrap-ups, okay?
It's very important today to see that what we are doing, that we have one lesson. Only 2% of the project developed in the Kyoto Protocol are coming from Africa. The majority is coming from China, from Brazil, from Mexico, from India. Only 2% from Africa. We need a new approach, and what we had developed in Morocco, with a strong proactive policy in this field, at the highest level of the state, it's the key point. The second point is the legal point. You need to change your legislation. That's how we're developing the solar program today in Morocco. It's because we changed the legislation concerning energy, and we can explain that to the private sector. And it's the private sector who is investing in such projects today here in the country. So it's very important for these 2 points. If you want the green economy to be developed in Africa, that you have this strong proactive policy. There is no project in Morocco today without environmental impact study before. It's the law. So you need the legislation and with this strong proactive policy. Thank you.
Sir, right here. And then this gentleman over there.
Thank you. My name is Ahmed Larouz from the Netherlands, as the president of CEDAR Network. I have 2 questions.
How many?
2 questions. I'm very quick,
okay.
Very quick. The first one is, if you don't want to see Africa as one, and let's take Latin America as one, and it seems that Brazil is taking the lead. Who do you think that will take the lead in Africa? That's the first question. The second question is, as a young Moroccan boy, an African boy, I have a dream. What is your dream about Africa 2050?
Thank you. Thank you very much. This gentleman back here. And then we'll take, there's one more person I think that had their hand up. All right, we'll take those last 2, and then I'll throw it back to the panel.
I'm Bako Kantiok from Nigeria. In view of the fact that it has already been mentioned that, yes, the IMF and the other Brentwood institutions might have guided our development to a certain extent, but you also have situations where African governments have crafted their own development agenda. In Nigeria, we had Vision 2010, Vision 2015. We now have Vision 2020. So I think one of the most fundamental challenges is the sustenance and continuity of such visions that encompasses economic and social development programs. So as Africans, how could we hold our system and our government, no matter who is in power or who is in control, to such policies so we can at least get development?
Okay, there's this young, go ahead, ma'am.
Hello, I'm Hayat Skati and work at the World Bank. I'm very interested in the debates of the fact if North Africa is actually part of Africa. Because at the World Bank, we consider Africa as being sub-Saharan Africa. It's not, North Africa is not even part of it. It's the MENA region. And for me, personally, I'm officially not Arab. I'm Berber of origin, like many others here in Morocco. So I would like to know from you if the road, ahead for Africa is the same as the road for North Africa. So what is the link between the two, and how can we, as North Africa, be beneficial for sub-Saharan Africa? Because I think there should be much more interlinkages between the two regions, if they are even regions.
Great, thank you very much. There was a gentleman up front here, I think. Is he? No, it wasn't. Go ahead, sir.
Cecil Griffiths from Liberia. I want to look at the issue of trade and industrialization. With all the investment that is coming to Africa, I wonder why some countries have not been able to utilize the funding. For example, you have our resources which are shipped, done into finished product and sent back to Africa. Why is it Liberia has a whole lot of rubber? Why is it that they can't have a rubber plant to make tires? or you have iron ore. Why is it that they can have a smelting? So these are challenges. So what's the problem? Is it lack of vision, or is it because of the way the market is structured? And lastly, on this issue of African unity, the concept was born in the 60s, and we missed the opportunity to be united. I think if we had gained that opportunity, we had followed up, would have been greater than the EU, because we started it. So the issue is not Gaddafi. I mean, it started way back. So I don't know what are the challenges. Why can't we pursue this issue and be united? Thank you.
Last question here, and then we're going to wrap it up. Go ahead, sir.
I am Donald. I'm from Sierra Leone. We have spoken much about youth unemployment, but one thing that is very, very important, and I would like the panelists to comment on, is underemployment. You would agree with me that most of the jobs that the young people are having, they are underpaid with those jobs. For an example, if you have somebody who is paid less than $100 for a month, how do we look at that issue? And I want the panelists to comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And sorry, this gentleman reminded me that I left him out, so go ahead, please, sir. Cutting you off already.
Larbi former diploma, Moroccan former diploma. So I would like now to comment on some what we start with, demography, for instance. It depends from what perspective we saw it. I was in India, I'm coming from India, and Indian consider demography as a factor of development instead of being a factor. So it depends, how your policy you have to deal with the problem, the problematic. About, the ambassador of Cape Verde said that we are still recycling and recycling and consuming the concept. I don't share your idea because, if you recycle it, but positively, yes. But unfortunately, sometimes, you are misusing the concept. And you see, when you produce, when you see the role of Africa and United Nations in multilateral, we are doing a lot, either in development, in self-determination, and in many important issues. So what we have to do, I think, that we are talking bilaterally, but India, Africa, play a good role on multilateral level. So that's why I think the role in United Nations and in non-alignment and in the other forum should be very used in the interest of Africa. Moroccans do a lot, very active in that kind, as an African country, and I like, that parable of the late king saying that Morocco is like a tree, it's deeply rooted from Africa. And we express a lot of solidarity in United Nations and in alignment, either in peacekeeping, in development, in culture, because we have in Morocco more than 10,000 African students, which is our policy towards, keeping our relation and solidarity with them. So I have a question, we see that today the relations are more between governmental and non-government. Now, a lot of society civil is very active now in developing cooperation. And the cooperation, as we say in Atlantic Dialogue, the role of OCP is doing is diplomatic, very important. So what is, the part of the non-governmental organization in developing the African solidarity? Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So there's a lot that was asked. Boko Haram, very interesting question about whether North Africa is part of when we talk about Africa? Are we including North Africa? Issues about more issues on the demographic. Why don't we just start with you, Colonel, and just answer one question and also give us your final thoughts.
One or two.
One or two. I'm already getting I'm getting the blinking red light over there that says they're going to put a hook in.
For the final thoughts, it's later, or I just do it after my answer. For the final thoughts.
Why don't you, if there's a particular answer that you'd like to take on, or a question that you'd like to take on, go ahead and do that, and also give us your final thoughts.
Okay. So I will start with the Boko Haram. I concur with my brother here from Portugal that Boko Haram is far from being a soft security issue. But if you have a close look at what is happening in the northern Nigeria, you will see that maybe there are also aspects that are related to religion, to tradition, and all that. So there is a soft aspect of it, and maybe also a hard aspect of it. I concur 100% with you. And my sister who talked about the identity, yes, in my opinion, if you don't have an identity, you don't have the confidence, the serenity that helps you not only face with confidence all these challenges we are facing throughout the world, but also you will not be able to take advantage of these huge opportunities the world is offering. So identity is something very positive, and each one of us needs to work on it. And Africa, as a continent, should be also working in setting its norms and its identity. Now, I will skip many other questions I was interested in having a say, but because of time constraint, I will just go directly to the question asked about Morocco and the Maghreb in general being part of sub-Saharan Africa or of Mediterranean. I think the interesting position of Maghreb is that you belong not only to sub-Saharan Africa, and you belong also to the Mediterranean world. And I think, in my modest contribution, I think that the wisest position would be to just assume your position as a bridge between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world. You belong to both of them. It's an opportunity for both Africa and Europe, and for the Maghreb also. Now, to wrap up and say my final thoughts, I will just go to my friend's question, which is about who could be the lead in Africa and what dream do I have for Africa. The leaders, they come throughout a process. You are a leader because you have the legitimacy to be the leader, because you're a problem solver, you are the economic power, you are the military power, you are respected, and you have the credibility that puts you in the position of being the leader. We don't declare leader. So, and about the dream I have for Africa, as a security guy, I really think that I would be very happy the day I will see Africa. I'm not naive. I know that conflict will always happen. But the day I will see Africa with really less conflict, minor conflict, and Africa where peace is prevailing, where we have stability, therefore the conditions for us to resolutely work on our development, educate our people, and be a good partner to our friends of the other regions.
Thank you very much, sir. Siri, why don't you take it next?
Thank you. I actually concur with a lot of what he had said on this question of the place of North Africa. When I talk of Africa, certainly in my context, I'm looking at the continent. I'm looking at the African Union with all its member states. So, but as he said, you can be part of several regions, depending on where your interests are and what sort of cooperation you want to establish. So you can be Africa, Maghreb, Mediterranean, Atlantic, you name it. There is it's not mutually exclusive in that sense. The dream for Africa, just like I said, Africa 2050. I want to see a continent that is prosperous, that is healthy, that can provide jobs for its youth, that can really leverage all the resources it has for its development, its sustainable development. That word matters a lot for me. And the question of leadership, yeah, as he said, we can even have all of the countries of Africa being leaders. We don't have to have a world or a continent where there is only one or two leaders. All of us can be leaders in different areas. So again, the more leaders we have, actually, the better it could be for the continent. And what our brother from Ghana said is absolutely right. I think Africa has gone through a lot of challenges. There are still challenges ahead, but we are also in a very unique period where we have lots of opportunities. And one of the opportunities to leverage is the fact that many other parts of the world are interested in what is happening in Africa. Let's use that to our advantage. There are certain choices that we have to make, that we have to assume, but there are also other things which we cannot do without the cooperation and partnership with all our other good friends across the world.
Thank you very much. Victor.
I will make some comments, but I'm afraid I won't have time.
Yeah, I think everybody's starting to look at you. I can hear stomachs growling.
And
so.
I seize the opportunity to say that the next meeting, we should give much more time to discuss Africa here, because if it's about Atlantic, Africa means a lot. Some comments about China, Brazil, and Africa. And this is a comment for Africans and for Europeans and for Brazilians, etc. I believe that Africa needs diversification. And I have some problems. Well, I understand, but I shouldn't understand why Europeans and Americans are so worried about China in Africa, because they are the main partner of China. The main partner of China is United States, Japan, European Union, and Africa is far behind. And if we want to think about the big Chinese game, I do not know if Africa is Chinese priority. So we must go beyond this atavic reaction and comments. And for Africa, it's and not neither or. And we must diversify and have all those partners, learning also from the history, not to repeat the same mistake.
Victor, let me just ask the word.
This is, you want me to conclude or not?
Okay, go ahead and conclude.
Okay. Another question is about Ambassador from Morocco. I do not want to say that demographics is a problem. It can be an asset, but demographics is linked to economic vitality. If we do not win this war, this battle of development, it will be a problem. But if you have economic development, it will be an asset. So we do not have enough people or enough people in abstract. It depends on the economic. Another comment is
Victor,
that...
I'm going to have to ask Zohra to let her answer.
My last word. I finished
okay,
with my
all right. Give me your word as a gentleman and a scholar.
Africa needs to achieve peace and security. This is basic, because without peace and security, we cannot do much. We need economic transformation. You need political change, and we need something we have been repeating here. Human capacity and leadership, and that will be no spontaneous leadership we need to work to forge a new kind of leadership. And I conclude that external actors that someone spoke about will be all the time present, and I believe also that they can play a very positive role in development, in democracy, but they should know also that perhaps sometimes promoting democracy is not the way they are doing, that our economic interests cannot be the same, and that we must agree to disagree and keep on working and not making disagreement as a way to stop cooperation. Cooperation will be tense. I do not have this angelical vision of cooperation, but we'll need to discuss it.
You have my vote. Yes, Zohra.
All right. I shall try to be extremely short and very pragmatic. I think the continent, or certainly blocs in the continent, interest groups, ought to use the new realignment of power and resources, global realignment of power and resources, to its full advantage, based on creating and institutionalizing good practice and institutions of good governance, so that economic challenges are complementary to responses to democratic deficits on the continent.
Thank you very, very much. I want to, as you can see, that this is such an, and you're right, there probably should be more panels devoted to this it's such a big continent with so many diverse cultures and countries that we can barely tackle it in an hour. But I want to join me in thanking our panel guests here.
And join me in thanking our moderator.
Thanks.
That was really, really terrific. Thank you so much. That was, I think for a lot of people that go to transatlantic meetings, that was a very different experience than we normally have, and it was really, really good.
Thank you.